We could very easily spend another 20 or 30 minutes talking about the unique features that every subtractive synth, especially the new ones, will give you in the oscillators section. But at the end of the day, the oscillator is just one part and one component to the sound. And that's really because, regardless of the blend you create, you still are having something that's pretty static unless you're modulating parameters within the oscillators. So, for example, if it's just a sawtooth wave or some kind of combination of multiple oscillators, you can hear a little bit of that detuning going on. So there's a slight deal of movement, but after about 5 seconds of listening, you as the listener realize nothing else is going to change. And so, as the sound designer, as the person responsible for generating the sound, first place you often then go is to the amplitude envelope so that you can, add a different sort of envelope to this. Like we could create a pad very easily. But even so, that's pretty boring after, a certain number of iterations. The sound itself isn't doing a whole lot. And while this in itself would be a very usable sound, I don't think that you could get away with having 10 or 15 sounds like this without having some other kind of moving force on the sound. It's just not going to work. And that's where the filter comes into play. So it adds a whole nother dimension to not only the timbres that you can generate, but when you start to add the filter with modulators, you're now having like 5 or 6 different parameters that are all shaping the sound and getting you diverse and rich and interesting textures. And that's why it's kind of remarkable how the oscillator section has been the thing that's really been built up and beefed up in instruments, but the filters and the movement of those filters is what kind of distinguishes one sound to another. But have no fear, unlike oscillator sections, which are extremely diverse, with filters, it really boils down to 2 things: common and uncommon. So that's what we'll be focused on for the remainder of this video. I'm going to go ahead and just take our percentage of white noise, bring it up to 100%, and we're going to bring up our span here, and you're going to hear some white noise. So it's going to be a little bit loud. I'll turn it down a bit. And this is what our white noise looks like in the display. So it's equal level at all frequencies. And the reason why it sounds so bright is because, think about it, from 10K to 20K, that's 10,000 individual sine waves being generated, more or less, right, if we break it down in FFT terms. And that's the equivalent of basically from 20 hertz up to 10,000. So there's a lot more energy happening here in the bright end. And that's why you get that very hissy type of a sound. Sometimes people wonder why, when it looks like this, does it sound the way it does? And that's the reason. It's pretty straightforward. If we were to extend this graph all the way out and not kind of go with an abbreviated scale, you'd, see this a little bit more clearly. All right, so when we're looking at this here, right away, you're noticing that something's weird based on my definition. I said it's equal power at all frequencies. Then why at the top here are we starting to see a roll-off? Well, the reason is because with this synthesizer, we can't turn the filter off. The filter is permanently on. And what we have by default is a low pass. So the lows will pass through and the highs get cut. And the cutoff filter here is set at 19.912K. So somewhere up here is the cutoff. Now, can we actually hear that this is making any difference? No, we definitely can't. But as we start to pull down on this, we're going to see what happens and hear what happens. Right? The lows are passing through. The highs are being cut down. And when it comes to learning synthesis, this used to be a much more difficult concept to explain, and it still can be if you don't get these visual displays of the filter shapes that you're using. And that's why when you're starting out with synthesis, it's a good idea to probably invest in a synthesizer that gives you some kind of a display, or hopefully the built-in one that you have with your DAW gives you these sort of images so that you can see and make these comparisons. So when I see this other type of low pass with a 4 next to it, and I click on it, we can watch and see what happens at the same cutoff point, no resonance. Okay, it's a much steeper and sharper curve. What if I go to this one here? It's corresponding what we see here is corresponding to what we see here. This is referred to a bandpass. It's a low pass and a high pass in combination. All right, let's try this steeper one. Yeah, exactly what we'd expect to have happen. And then we go to high pass. So now we're seeing that at the top here, like I was saying before, when we were in low pass, we saw how it was sloping. Now we actually are getting that equal amounts of energy there in the high end. And as we should expect, when we go to the 4, it's just going to be steeper. And it is. And then we have a notch, which is the inverse of the bandpass. Notch out a small range. And so the next control worth looking at is resonance. Resonance is just going to bump up the cutoff frequency point. So it's going to add emphasis to that. Oftentimes you might see this called emphasis. I can't remember exactly what it's called in the Monarch or in the Mini Moog. It might be called emphasis. It might be called something else. Different synths use different names for resonance, but for the most part, if you see something next to a cutoff knob, it's going to be the resonance regardless of what they call it. So if we go back into low pass mode here and I bring up the resonance, we're going to see a spike. And it's spiking right out of the display. Same thing holds true on the steeper cutoff. With the bandpass, it's actually the inverse, so it's going to narrow this range and emphasize the cutoff. Same thing is true here. Same thing is going to be true for our high pass filters. And with our notch, this actually then is not going to take away as much. Sorry, I'm trying to talk while hearing the white noise, so I may have said the wrong thing. But as we bring up the resonance, eventually it goes away entirely. So this would probably be the mode you would put it in if you actually wanted the filter to have no effect whatsoever. All right, so those are common shapes. We can actually see here that with this program, we have another whole filter plugin that we can load in called the ladder. And so the ladder is a little bit different to the filter built into the instrument in that we get some additional shapes. And now we see LP1, LP2, LP3, LP4. My guess is that LP1 is corresponding to a 6 dB per octave. LP2, which I believe is here in the filter, is 12. 3 would be 18, 4 would be 24, and we can go through and get those other variations that we don't get from the filter here. So when we look at the low pass one, you can see how even when we take it down to something like 300, you see how far the signal is still extending up? We can very easily compare that here. Go down to something like 300 and you see just how much more is being cut off. And you can see how that changes there over time. All right, so that pretty much does it for common shapes. I'll pause the video, come back, we'll look at some uncommon filter options. For the remainder of this video, we're going to be looking at Serum, and that's not to try to say that this instrument gives you the most filter options or that they sound the best. We'll leave some of that discussion for the sound engine video. You know, why does one low pass sound different to another low pass? But what I like about Serum is the fact that it gives us some nice kind of displays. Again, you get that extra visual feedback, and that can be very useful with some of these. Like, for example, if I looked at multi and I saw PN12, like, what do you think that means? I have no idea. But when I click on it, we can see that, okay, this is a notch filter. When I'm turning the resonance and the cutoff here, okay, I'm seeing a peak. So we have a peak and a notch, and then we have control over those different frequency points as well as a resonance control on the peak. So I now have an idea of what this is doing and what it's probably going to sound like. So with a lot of these specialty type filter. So I'm just going to turn this off for now so I can show you. A lot of times what you can imagine is like an EQ that has a kind of bizarre and interesting curve. So here we are before, and here we are after. And then when you're moving cutoff, it could kind of be like this shift control, which is going to be moving everything to the left or to the right, in conjunction with some other knob movement that's maybe changing around some of these bands. And then in conjunction, you know, if those were moving at different times, you'd get some kind of very bizarre and interesting sound, something that you wouldn't expect with just a single traditional common filter shape. So jumping back here into Serum, one question you might have that a lot of people have from the get-go is, why is the low pass filter so popular? We see that we have 8 options of low pass here from normal. We go into multi, we're seeing L a lot, which I assume is referring to low pass. In the case of LP here, it must be low and peak. And I go into my miscellaneous, I also see that I have a few other low pass options, a French low pass, a German low pass, an add bass, which is probably also some kind of a low pass. And the reason is actually very simple. When you think about a pitched sound, a lot of the emphasis is on the fundamental, so that initial frequency from which the rest of that harmonic series, or in some cases inharmonic partials, are then generated from. And if you have a low pass, that guarantees the integrity of the fundamental, unless you pull the cutoff all the way down, in which case there's not going to be any sound at all. And that's really the main reason for that. You're adding and taking away brilliance, keeping the fundamental intact so that that pitch, that initial main pitch, is coming through and therefore playing nicely, staying in tune with all the rest of your instruments. You can take a high pass and remove the fundamental, leave the upper partials, and your brain will be able to still work out what the fundamental is, but it's a little more dangerous because now you have so much brightness into the sound. You can only get away with that on a couple of things. The reason I'm telling you this is because when you do go in and maybe try out some of these specialties, like let's see if there's anything really interesting here. Let's choose this thing. I don't know, it's a phaser of some kind. I want to use something more hybrid. Let's go here. Let's listen to this. This will be interesting. Here's our white noise. Oh, cool. That kind of sounds like a sign designy element you'd hear with like a spaceship. You probably wouldn't be running white noise into it, but we could easily add some reverb, not make this be white noise, or maybe even afterwards, and this is what I wanted to show you, is that when you're using specialty or uncommon filter shapes, that normally you're going to have another filter somewhere you can use, and you'd probably then be going with one of those common shapes. And it's common for a reason. This is what works very well. So here, I could go into my effects, and I could add a second filter. This filter is at the bottom. It's affecting everything in front of it. This is basically the last thing before going to the master out, which we could shape around if we wanted the EQ or something after, but you know, whatever. And then with the oscillator, we can choose what is and isn't routed into the filter. And here we just have the noise, but you see we have something for sub oscillator, oscillator A, oscillator B. But with this secondary filter and it being a low pass, but I might also add in here, let's see, a phaser, flanger actually is what I want. Slow that down a little bit. You can see that inside of this distortion, again, there's such an importance placed on the low pass filter. Trying to find a nice sweet spot here. And so to create this sound, what I'd do is I'd go into my effects, I'd add a little bit of a large reverb space probably here. Probably would make it a plate, make it pretty large, no high cut. A little bit of low cut. And then to create this sound, I would use an envelope, and I'd have that envelope controlling this. And so that's kind of a cool sound. And then if we were actually to key track this noise, we could go down a couple octaves. Right, but the final filter here is still playing a pretty big role in this sound. Without it, it actually sounds kind of cooler without it in there, but that's because I've now, using all these effects, kind of eliminated, as well as using the key tracking on the white noise, I've almost eliminated the noise component entirely. But I think my point is that when you're using specialty or uncommon filters, it makes sense a lot of times to combine them with something that's a little more traditional and common. Usually that's going to be a low pass. So I'll leave it up to you to maybe go through and explore some of these different ones. But really, it's a lot of fun, but something to be careful of, that when you're using traditional pitched instruments, having that common filter shape can be very useful. You see that we have things like mix controls in here, so we could actually set the depth of this filter if we were going to use a second one in conjunction with it. Just another unique sound design tool, and something that you can certainly, again, this is a great way to sort of branch your sounds out to make them a little different than other people's. You don't have to do anything too extreme, but just a little bit here and there often goes a pretty long way. One final category of filters that's worth our attention are what are referred to as vowel filters or Formant filters. And there was a time when these weren't particularly widespread. There were only a few synthesizers that offered it. With the modern synths, it's pretty much built into all of them. And this is what allows you to emulate that kind of vowel sound. And what's nice about Serum is that you can even kind of visualize that. Believe it or not, you can create your own like Formant filters using an EQ. If you go online and search like Formant table, you'll be able to kind of understand how this is being done. It's like a linguistics thing, really, how we're able to, vibrate our vocal cord and use our mouth and the shape of our mouth to get that sound. But obviously here, that's not what's going on. It's all emulated, but it's a pretty cool effect. So when we have our sine wave here, we can go and find our Formant filters, of which there are 3 varieties in this synth. They don't label for you exactly what each of them is, so you have to go in and kind of listen. The first one, I think, goes all the way through. It goes from like A or like ah all the way to like a U or like an sound. So let's just grab that, pull it up. So there's the ah. Get a little bit of variation. I want to try to make it higher. I like it down there. So you hear that. That was a technical thing I just did there. But what's really then cool about this is, since you have the 2 filters together, we could come up here and like find some kind of preset. Let's try this one. Let's see if another filter is being used here in the effects. It is not. What I could do is I could come in here and grab this filter and immediately take this nice preset that's already been provided for me and create like a talking bass sound, or at the very least a wobbly one using a Formant. So I'll go into the miscellaneous. I'll take Formant 1, grab one of these LFOs, LFO 3. This is just as classic as it gets. I'm going to put that on the cutoff. I guess I like it. So we can hear how big of a difference that's making. I think that's because we're now before the coming in after the distortion. So I'm going to put that before. And what I would probably do is take a macro control here and actually have that go onto rate, and then maybe bring this down a little bit. So that's kind of a cool thing you could do, very quickly take a traditional sound and throw a Formant filter on there to give it a little more spice. And you wouldn't just have to use an LFO, obviously. You could also use an envelope, and that might work really well in this case. Have that control the cutoff and have it go through some of the vowel sounds. So just explore and see if your synthesizer gives you the Formant options. It's something that was kind of overused for a time, but it definitely adds a little bit of spice into some of your sounds, and it's especially a fun thing I've always found to do with presets. And I'd actually probably take the mix control and bring that down, just have it be like a subtle thing here, like right in there.